Hi guys, it's Babs with Listen to Your Inner You. Thank you for watching and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Help me grow my channel. I have a donation link below in the box. Also, my website is listentoyourinneryou.com. You can book sessions on there. It'll show up in your own time zone. And welcome today. Today's subject line is, drum roll, what do I do when my story doesn't change? You know what stories are, right? It's things that constantly play out, and sometimes we like it and sometimes we like them not. So when there's a story that we don't like, first we have to identify what the story is. You'll know if it's a negative story playing out and you realize what the story is and you say it out loud, you will be probably upset of some sort. You will feel some sort of upsetting emotion. That's when you know you hit the right story. So first you identify it, right? And then you accept it. You accept that the story is in place and that it's playing out. Whatever you need to accept, you accept it until it doesn't bother you anymore. Then you accept all the feelings around it until it doesn't bother you anymore. This is pretty quick. This happens within minutes often, sometimes hours with the acceptance. But usually by the time you realize what the story is and you identify it, you're ready to release it and you can accept it pretty quickly. Then you want to turn it around. So you find the opposite story. And when you find the opposite story, you usually feel some kind of relief or happiness or, some kind of more positive than you felt before. It'll feel better than the opposite story that you discovered. That's when you know you hit the right opposite story, the one you actually want. Sometimes it takes a little bit to find the right wording, and that's okay too. Sometimes I use the thesaurus or the dictionary and look that up. And then you start changing the story. And after a couple of times, maybe after a day or so, it'll feel like it's true and you feel really good, right? You keep changing the story every time your brain says the opposite, you replace it. And then within a day or two, maybe you can hit the spot where it'll feel true. And that's when you kind of set the new story. But the next step is then the old energy. Then the old energy hits when everything goes the opposite direction. Either it'll play out in the negative, in the old version that you don't want anymore, or you actually get a lot of brain function that says, no, you can't have this. It's not going to happen, blah, blah, blah. So if you're just changing one story at a time, this is pretty easy because every time your brain comes up with a negative thought, even if you don't know that it has to do with the story, if it's a negative thought, I would make it about that story. I do the same thing for belief work. Every time I change a belief or a story, and I just have one at a time that I'm doing, then I make every single negative thought that comes up or action around me that makes me upset, everything negative that triggers me in that moment, I make it about that belief or about that story and that only, even if it looks like it has nothing to do with it. But for me, I've noticed, I've tracked the thoughts back. They always lead back to that story somehow or that belief. I'm like, okay, so from then on out, I decided everything is going to be around this one belief or this one story. So I start changing it. I'm an old energy, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes I get stuck and I'm like, okay, nothing's happening. Stories can be changed usually within a week, really quickly. Usually the first 2-3 days are the most intense. Even if you've had that story for a long time, if you've had that belief for a long time. Beliefs in general are harder to change when they're older core beliefs, when you were really young and they were ingrained in you. A belief could be 10 or 15 years old and you can still change it within a week because it's still just a story and not a belief. Actual beliefs take longer and they're a lot more rare. You have a lot less beliefs than you have stories because 5 beliefs can create hundreds of stories, and stories can actually create other stories. So if my story isn't changing, then I have another video about this, right? Either I have attachment towards it, or I have resistance, or another belief is overriding, or another story is overriding it. So if I get stuck and my story isn't actually changing, and I will give you an example here shortly, then what do I do? Well, keep going. Because one of these things that I just mentioned in that other video about why your story might not be changing, it'll come up. You just have to pay attention to what you're saying out loud. And often I let my mind just do its job, and then let my mouth do its job. And when I get really frustrated, I just say these things out loud, because you're not going to manifest all this negative shit that you're saying within a second, because you're saying it once. So you're not necessarily in alignment with it just because you say it out loud once. So I let my brain do its job. And sometimes I yell these things out. Sometimes I write it in my diary and just let my mind go nuts and write it all out. And then boom, it shows up in front of me, or boom, it shows up out of here, right? So I trust my mind that it does its job. So when a story doesn't change, I keep going with the story. I keep sticking to the story because eventually either I will release that resistance towards that story that I have, because you could have another story that interferes with that story that is keeping you in resistance, or you have another story that is keeping you in attachment with that story, or you discover the belief. Because the longer you stick to that new story, again, I will give you an example, the more clear it'll get, because your mind wants to release these things. It wants to detach, it wants to release these things. The longer you stick to the end result, the easier it gets to actually work through these things. And that applies to manifestations, it applies to belief changing, it applies to story changing, but this is specifically about story changing, right? So keep sticking to the story until something pops up that now makes sense why it hasn't changed yet. It could be a belief, it could be another story, it could be attachment, it could be anything. So the story that was really big for me was nothing is changing. Everything is the same. And this happened after I worked through all the big core beliefs. And nothing was changing. Nothing was different. And I was getting so upset. And then for months, I was stuck on that. And I released a bunch of other things and I was working through it. But eventually I discovered that came from, and then nothing's happening came up. And then eventually I figured out those 3 stories came from another story, and that was, it's not working. And then I realized it's not working is coming from, I'm doing it wrong. So I discovered all these other stories, that this one story of I'm not doing it right or I'm doing it wrong was creating all these other stories. And it had even actually 10 or 12 other stories. It created all these stories for all my manifestations. I'm like, what the fuck is happening? This is weird. This is crazy. So I wrote them all out. I had like 15 stories that this one story created of I'm not doing it right. That's a stupid story. I hated it. That one gave me a hard time because working through that one with the old energy was awful. It made me feel so awful. Sometimes they feel so dramatic and awful, like the world is ending and nothing is ever going to happen and blah, 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 blah. So I started changing these, but I had to work backwards, right? First I found nothing has changed. Everything is the same. Then nothing is happening. I worked my way backwards. That's what we do in manifesting, deliberate manifesting. When we go through resistance work, we work our way backwards until we find that one thing that caused all the other things. And sometimes it's multiple big things that cause a ton of other little stories that are just annoying. But that's how you find them, is by working through that. So I stuck to the ones I first found were nothing is changing, nothing is different. So I started, everything has changed, everything is different. I did that until something came up, released resistance around them. I had attachment, because when I came out of these core beliefs, I had so much attachment towards everything, because that's my whole life. I was attached to everything. I'm sure you can relate. So then I changed those 2, then I found nothing's happening, and eventually nothing's happening was long enough, it was kicking long enough that I realized that was what was causing nothing is changing and nothing is different. And then I realized that one was caused by it's not working, and that one was caused by I'm not doing it right. So I'm like, oh shit, that's how I found it. And that was the end of it, because I couldn't find anything anymore. But then I was changing, I'm not doing it right to I'm doing it right, accepted it, blah, accepted how I felt about it, right, do all the acceptance stuff. And then I started changing it. I am doing it right. I am doing it right. I was doing that for a couple of days, and I realized I had major attachment towards it. So I actually released the attachment. So I was 5 days into working for that, and I was attached the whole time, and it felt more awful. Usually when you have attachment towards something, it feels a lot more dramatic than it does, or it should, or can. It feels like you're really needy about it, right? So I released the attachment towards it, and then I had to start over again, because the attachment kept me attached and kept that story alive of I'm not doing it right. So I released the attachment, and then I started working through the story again, and then finally after 3 days I got some release, because a regular story, if you're changing a regular story, could be 10 years old, don't care, a normal story that is not a core belief, I'm going to say that beliefs from now on are just core beliefs, right? But it's a story. Most things are a story. We don't have a lot of beliefs. We have mostly stories in place. And those can be changed within 5 to 7 days, usually easily. Sometimes 10 days, the bigger stories, or if you have attachment towards it or resistance around it, that is possible. Sometimes it can take maybe 10, 20 days. Who knows? It depends on what you have in place and what's around it. But a normal story can change within 5 days. In the first 2 to 3 days or more. With old energy, they're usually more extreme. They feel a lot more intense to work through that old energy. So I hope this helped. When I get stuck on a story and the story isn't changing, I keep going with that story until I either work through the attachment, the resistance, because you can have resistance. You can have another story overriding it, or attachment around it, or I find the belief that's causing it, or I find something else that's causing it. I keep going with that story. And this is the same process for manifesting. You keep sticking to the end result, and that's how these things pop up. And you do the same thing with stories and beliefs. So when I get stuck and a story isn't changing, I keep going with the story until my mind gives me a clear communication saying, hey, you've got this in place, and then you release that. So I hope this helped. If you need any more help, any questions, please book a session. I do not answer questions anymore. I do respond on my channel to nice comments or mean comments, both. I don't get a lot of mean comments usually, but if you have any video requests, you can send those on my channel, on my comments too. I love those. Have a great day.